What is Property? An Inquiry into the Principle of Right and of Government, by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Conclusion. Part 3. In the preface to this pamphlet on la paix et le gouvernement, as well as in his defence before the jury, M. Lamennais frankly declared himself an advocate of property. Out of regard for the author and his misfortune, I shall abstain from characterizing this declaration and from examining those two sorrowful performances. M. Lamennais seems to be only the tool of a quasi-radical party, which flatters him in order to use him, without respect for a glorious but henceforth powerless old age. What means this profession of faith? From the first number of L'Avenir to Esquisse d'une philosophie, M. Lamennais always favours equality, association, and even a sort of vague and indefinite communism. M. Lamennais, in recognizing the right of property, gives the lie to his past career, and renounces his most generous tendencies. Can it then be true that in this man, who has been too roughly treated, but who is also too easily flattered, strength of talent has already outlived strength of will? It is said that M. Lamennais has rejected the offers of several of his friends to try to procure for him a commutation of his sentence. M. Lamennais prefers to serve out his time. May not this affection of a false stoicism come from the same source as his recognition of the right of property? The Huron, when taken prisoner, hurls insults and threats at his conqueror. That is the heroism of the savage. The martyr prays for his executioners and is willing to receive from them his life. That is the heroism of the Christian. Why has the apostle of love become an apostle of anger and revenge? Has then the translator of La Imitation forgotten that he who offends charity cannot honor virtue? Galileo, retracting on his knees before the tribunal of his Inquisition his heresy in regard to the movement of the earth, and recovering at that price his liberty, seems to me 100 times grander than M. Lamennais. What, if we suffer for truth and justice, must we, in retaliation, thrust our persecutors outside the pale of human society? And when sentenced to an unjust punishment, must we decline exemption if it is offered to us, because it pleases a few base satellites to call it a pardon? Such is not the wisdom of Christianity. But I forgot that in the presence of M. Lamennais this name is no longer pronounced. May the prophet of L'Avenir be soon restored to liberty and his friends, but, above all, may he henceforth derive his inspiration only from his genius and his heart. O proletaires, proletaires, how long are you to be victimized by this spirit of revenge and implacable hatred which your false friends kindle, and which perhaps has done more harm to the development of reformatory ideas than the corruption, ignorance, and malice of the government? Believe me, at the present time everybody is to blame. In fact, in intention or in example, all are found wanting, and you have no right to excuse anyone. The king himself, God forgive me, I do not like to justify a king. The king himself is, like his predecessors, only the personification of an idea, and an idea, proletaires, which possesses you yet. His greatest wrong consists in wishing for its complete realization, while you wish it realized only partially; consequently, in being logical in his government, while you, in your complaints, are not at all so. You clamour for a second regicide. He that is without sin among you, let him cast at the Prince of Property the first stone. How successful you would have been if, in order to influence men, you had appealed to the self-love of men; if, in order to alter the Constitution and the law, you had placed yourselves within the Constitution and the law. 50,000 laws, they say, make up our political and civil codes. Of these 50,000 laws, 25,000 are for you, 25,000 against you. Is it not clear that your duty is to oppose the former to the latter, and thus, by the argument of contradiction, drive privilege into its last ditch? This method of action is henceforth the only useful one, being the only moral and rational one. For my part, if I had the ear of this nation, to which I am attached by birth and predilection, with no intention of playing the leading part in the future republic, I would instruct the laboring masses to conquer property through institutions and judicial pleadings, to seek auxiliaries and accomplices in the highest ranks of society, and to ruin all privileged classes by taking advantage of their common desire for power and popularity. The petition for the electoral reform has already received 200,000 signatures, and the illustrious Arago threatens us with 1,000,000. Surely that will be well done. But from this 1,000,000 of citizens, who are as willing to vote for an emperor as for equality, could we not select 10,000 signatures? I mean bona fide signatures, whose authors can read, write, cipher, and even think a little, and whom we could invite, after due perusal and verbal explanation, to sign such a petition as the following: To His Excellency the Minister of the Interior. Monsieur le Ministre, on the day when a royal ordinance decreeing the establishment of model national workshops shall appear in the Moniteur, the undersigned, to the number of 10,000, will repair to the palace of the Tuileries, and there, with all the power of their lungs, will shout, Long live Louis Philippe! On the day when the Moniteur shall inform the public that this petition is refused, the undersigned, to the number of 10,000, will say secretly in their hearts, Down with Louis Philippe! If I am not mistaken, such a petition would have some effect. Footnote. The electoral reform, it is continually asserted, is not an end, but a means. Undoubtedly. But what, then, is the end? Why not furnish an unequivocal explanation of its object? How can the people choose their representatives unless they know in advance the purpose for which they choose them, and the object of the commission which they entrust to them? But it is said the very business of those chosen by the people is to find out the object of the reform. That is a quibble. What is to hinder these persons, who are to be elected in future, from first seeking for this object, and then, when they have found it, from communicating it to the people? The reformers have well said that while the object of the electoral reform remains in the least indefinite, it will be only a means of transferring power from the hands of petty tyrants to the hands of other tyrants. We know already how a nation may be oppressed by being led to believe that it is obeying only its own laws. The history of universal suffrage among all nations is the history of the restrictions of liberty by and in the name of the multitude. Still, if the electoral reform in its present shape were rational, practical, acceptable to clean consciences and upright minds, perhaps one might be excused, though ignorant of its object, for supporting it. But no, the text of the petition determines nothing, makes no distinctions, requires no conditions, no guarantee. It establishes the right without the duty. Every Frenchman is a voter, and eligible to office. As well say, every bayonet is intelligent, every savage is civilized, every slave is free. In its vague generality, the reformatory petition is the weakest of abstractions, or the highest form of political treason. Consequently, the enlightened patriots distrust and despise each other. The most radical writer of the time, he whose economical and social theories are, without comparison, the most advanced, M. Leroux, has taken a bold stand against universal suffrage and democratic government, and has written an exceedingly keen criticism of J. Rousseau. That is undoubtedly the reason why M. Leroux is no longer the philosopher of La Nationale. That journal, like Napoleon, does not like men of ideas. Nevertheless, La Nationale ought to know that he who fights against ideas will perish by ideas. End of footnote. The pleasure of a popular ovation would be well worth the sacrifice of a few millions. They sow so much to reap unpopularity. Then, if the nation, its hopes of 1830 restored, should feel its duty to keep its promise, and it would keep it, for the word of the nation is, like that of God, sacred. If I say the nation, reconciled by this act with the public-spirited monarchy, should bear to the foot of the throne its cheers and its vows, and should at that solemn moment choose me to speak in its name, the following would be the substance of my speech. Sire, this is what the nation wishes to say to your majesty. O king, you see what it costs to gain the applause of the citizens. Would you like us henceforth to take for our motto, "Let us help the king will help us"? Do you wish the people to cry, "The king and the French nation"? Then abandon these grasping bankers, these quarrelsome lawyers, these miserable bourgeois, these infamous writers, these dishonoured men. All these, sire, hate you, and continue to support you only because they fear us. Finish the work of our kings, wipe out aristocracy and privilege, consult with these faithful proletaries, with the nation, which alone can honour a sovereign, and sincerely shout, "Long live the king!" The rest of what I have to say, sir, is for you alone. Others would not understand me. You are, I perceive, a republican as well as an economist, and your patriotism revolts at the very idea of addressing to the authorities a petition in which the government of Louis Philippe should be tacitly recognized. National workshops? It were well to have such institutions established, you think, but patriotic hearts will never accept them from an aristocrat ministry, nor by the courtesy of a king. Already, undoubtedly, your old prejudices have returned, and you now regard me only as a sophist, as ready to flatter the powers that be as to dishonour, by pushing them to an extreme, the principles of equality and universal fraternity. What shall I say to you? That I should so lightly compromise the future of my theories? Either this clever sophistry which is attributed to me must be at bottom a very trifling affair, or else my convictions must be so firm that they deprive me of free will. But not to insist further on the necessity of a compromise between the executive power and the people, it seems to me, sir, that in doubting my patriotism you reason very capriciously, and that your judgments are exceedingly rash. You, sir, ostensibly defending government and property, are allowed to be a republican, reformer, phalansterian, anything you wish. I, on the contrary, demanding distinctly enough a slight reform in public economy, am foreordained a conservative, and likewise a friend of the dynasty. I cannot explain myself more clearly, so firm a believer am I in the philosophy of accomplished facts and the status quo of governmental forms, that instead of destroying that which exists and beginning over again the past, I prefer to render everything legitimate by correcting it. It is true that the corrections which I propose, though respecting the form, tend to finally change the nature of the things corrected. Who denies it? But it is precisely that which constitutes my system of status quo. I make no war upon symbols, figures, or phantoms. I respect scarecrows and bow before bugbears. I ask, on the one hand, that property be left as it is, but that interest on all kinds of capital be gradually lowered and finally abolished. On the other hand, that the charter be maintained in its present shape, but that method be introduced into administration and politics. That is all. Nevertheless, submitting to all that is, though not satisfied with it, I endeavour to conform to the established order, and to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Is it thought, for instance, that I love property? Very well. I am myself a proprietor, and do homage to the right of increase, as is proved by the fact that I have creditors to whom I faithfully pay, every year, a large amount of interest. The same with politics. Since we are monarchy, I would cry, "Long live the king," rather than suffer death, which does not prevent me, however, from demanding that the irremovable, inviolable, and hereditary representative of the nation shall act with the proletaries against the privileged classes. In a word, that the king shall become the leader of the radical party. Thereby we proletaries would gain everything, and I am sure that at this price Louis Philippe might secure to his family the perpetual presidency of the republic, and this is why I think so. If there existed in France but one great functional inequality, the duty of the functionary being, from one end of the year to the other, to hold full court of savants, artists, soldiers, deputies, inspectors, it is evident that the expenses of the presidency then would be the national expenses, and that through the reversion of the civil list to the mass of consumers, the great inequality of which I speak would form an exact equation with the whole nation. Of this no economist needs a demonstration. Consequently, there would be no more fear of cliques, courtiers, and appendages, since no new inequality could be established. The king, as king, would have friends, unheard of thing, but no family. His relatives or kinsmen, agnés et cognés, if they were fools, would be nothing to him, and in no case, with the exception of heir apparent, would they have, even in court, more privileges than others. No more nepotism, no more favour, no more baseness. No one would go to court save when duty required, or when called by an honourable distinction, and as all conditions would be equal and all functions equally honoured, there would be no other emulation than that of merit and virtue. I wish the King of the French could say without shame, my brother the gardener, my sister-in-law the milkmaid, my son the prince royal, and my son the blacksmith. His daughter might well be an artist. That would be beautiful, sir. That would be royal. No one but a buffoon could fail to understand it. In this way I have come to think that the forms of royalty may be made to harmonize with the requirements of equality, and have given a monarchical form to my republican spirit. I have seen that France contains by no means as many democrats as is generally supposed, and I have compromised with the monarchy. I do not say, however, that if France wanted a republic, I could not accommodate myself equally well, and perhaps better. By nature I hate all signs of distinction, crosses of honour, gold, lace, liveries, costumes, honorary titles, and above all parades. If I had my way, no general should be distinguished from a soldier, nor a peer of France from a peasant. Why have I never taken part in a review? For I am happy to say, sir, that I am a National Guard. I have nothing else in the world but that. Because the review is always held at a place which I do not like, and because they have fools for officers whom I am compelled to obey. You see, this is not the best of my history, that, in spite of my conservative opinions, my life is a perpetual sacrifice to the Republic. Nevertheless, I doubt if such simplicity would be agreeable to French vanity, to that inordinate love of distinction and flattery which makes our nation the most frivolous in the world. Monsieur Lamartine, in his grand Meditation on Bonaparte, calls the French a nation of Brutuses. We are merely a nation of Narcissuses. Previous to '89, we had the aristocracy of blood. Then every bourgeois looked down upon the commonalty and wished to be a nobleman. Afterwards, distinction was based on wealth, and the bourgeoisie, jealous of the nobility and proud of their money, used 1830 to promote, not liberty by any means, but the aristocracy of wealth. When, through the force of events and the natural laws of society, for the development of which France offers such free play, equality shall be established in functions and fortunes, then the beaux and the belles, the savants and the artists, will form new classes. There is a universal and innate desire in this Gallic country for fame and glory. We must have distinctions, be they what they may, nobility, wealth, talent, beauty, or dress. I suspect Arrange and Garnier-Page of having aristocratic manners, and I picture to myself our great journalists in their columns so friendly to the people, administering rough kicks to the compositors in their printing offices. This man, once said Le National, in speaking of Carrel, whom we had proclaimed first consul, is it not true that the monarchical principle still lives in the hearts of our democrats, and that they want universal suffrage in order to make themselves kings? Since Le National prides itself on holding more fixed opinions than Le Journal des Débats, I presume that Armand Carrel, being dead, Monsieur Armand Marrast is now first consul, and Monsieur Garnier-Pages second consul. In everything the deputy must give way to the journalist. I do not speak of Monsieur Arago, whom I believe to be, in spite of calumny, too learned for the consulship. Be it so. Though we have consuls, our position is not much altered. I am ready to yield my share of sovereignty to Monsieur Armand Marrast and Garnier-Pages, the appointed consuls, provided they will swear, on entering upon the duties of their office, to abolish property and not to be haughty. Forever promises, forever oaths. Why should the people trust in tribunes when kings perjure themselves? Alas! Truth and honesty are no longer, as in the days of King John, in the mouth of princes. A whole senate has been convicted of felony, and the interest of the governors always being, for some mysterious reason, opposed to the interest of the governed. Parliaments follow each other while the nation dies of hunger. No, no, no more protectors, no more emperors, no more consuls. Better manage our affairs ourselves than through agents. Better associate our industries than beg for monopolies, and since the Republic cannot dispense with virtues, we should labour for our reform. This, therefore, is my line of conduct. I preach emancipation to the proletaries, association to the labourers, equality to the wealthy. I push forward the revolution by all means in my power, the tongue, the pen, the press, by action and example. My life is a continual apostleship. Yes, I am a reformer. I say it as I think it, in good faith, and that I may be no longer reproached for my vanity. I wish to convert the world. Very likely this fancy springs from an enthusiastic pride, which may have turned to delirium, but it will be admitted at least that I have plenty of company, and that my madness is not monomania. At the present day everybody wishes to be reckoned among the lunatics of Beranger, to say nothing of the Babeufs, the Marats, and the Robespierres, who swarm in our streets and workshops. All the great reformers of antiquity live again in the most illustrious personages of our time. One is Jesus Christ, another Moses, a third Mahomet. This is Orpheus, that Plato, or Pythagoras. Gregory VII himself has risen from the grave together with the evangelists and the apostles, and it may turn out that even I am that slave who, having escaped from his master's house, was forthwith made a bishop and a reformer by St. Paul. As for the virgins and holy women, they are expected daily. At present we have only Aspasias and courtesans. Now, as in all diseases, their diagnostic varies according to the temperament, so my madness has its peculiar aspect and distinguishing characteristic. Reformers, as a general thing, are jealous of their role. They suffer no rivals, they want no partners, they have disciples, but no co-labourers. 'Tis my desire, on the contrary, to communicate my enthusiasm, and to make it, as far as I can, epidemic. I wish that all were like myself, reformers, in order that there might be no more sects, and that Christs, antichrists, and false Christs might be forced to understand and agree with each other. Again, every reformer is a magician, or at least desires to become one. Thus Moses, Jesus Christ, and the apostles proved their mission by miracles. Mahomet ridiculed miracles after having endeavoured to perform them. Fourier, more cunning, promises us wonders when the globe shall be covered with phalansteries. For myself, I have as great a horror of miracles as of authorities, and aim only at logic. That is why I continually search after the criterion of certainty. I work for the reformation of ideas. Little matters it that they find me dry and austere. I mean to conquer by a bold struggle, or die in the attempt. And whoever shall come to the defence of property, I swear that I will force him to argue like Monsieur Considerant, or philosophize like Monsieur Troplong. Finally, and it is here that I differ most from my compeers, I do not believe it necessary, in order to reach equality, to turn everything topsy-turvy. To maintain that nothing but an overturn can lead to reform is, in my judgment, to construct a syllogism, and to look for the truth in the regions of the unknown. Now I am for generalization, induction, and progress. I regard general disappropriation as impossible. Attacked from that point, the problem of universal association seems to me insolvable. Property is like the dragon which Hercules killed. To destroy it, it must be taken, not by the head, but by the tail, that is, by profit and interest. I stop. I have said enough to satisfy any one who can read and understand. The surest way by which the government can baffle intrigues and break up parties is to take possession of science, and point out to the nation, at an already appreciable distance, the rising oriflamme of equality; to say to those politicians of the tribune and the press, for whose fruitless quarrels we pay so dearly, you are rushing forward, blind as you are, to the abolition of property, but the government marches with its eyes open. You hasten the future by unprincipled and insincere controversy, but the government, which knows this future, leads you thither by a happy and peaceful transition. The present generation will not pass away before France, the guide and model of civilized nations, has regained her rank and legitimate influence. But alas, the government itself, who shall enlighten it? Who can induce it to accept this doctrine of equality, whose terrible but decisive formula the most generous minds hardly dare to acknowledge? I feel my whole being tremble when I think that the testimony of three men, yes, of three men who make it their business to teach and define, would suffice to give full play to public opinion, to change beliefs, and to fix destinies. Will not the three men be found? May we hope or not? What must we think of those who govern us, in the world of sorrow in which the proletary moves, and where nothing is known of the intentions of power? It must be said that despair prevails. But you, sir, you, who by function belong to the official world, you, in whom the people recognize one of their noblest friends, and property its most prudent adversary, what say you of our deputies, our ministers, our king? Do you believe that the authorities are friendly to us? Then let the government declare its position. Let it print its profession of faith in equality, and I am dumb. Otherwise I shall continue the war, and the more obstinacy and malice is shown, the oftener will I redouble my energy and audacity. I have said before, and I repeat it, I have sworn, not on the dagger and the death's head, amid the horrors of a catacomb, and in the presence of men besmeared with blood, but I have sworn on my conscience to pursue property, to grant it neither peace nor truce, until I see it everywhere execrated. I have not yet published half the things that I have to say concerning the right of domain, nor the best things. Let the knights of property, if there are any who fight otherwise than by retreating, be prepared every day for a new demonstration and accusation. Let them enter the arena armed with reason and knowledge, not wrapped up in sophisms, for justice will be done. To become enlightened we must have liberty. That alone suffices, but it must be the liberty to use the reason in regard to all public matters. And yet we hear on every hand authorities of all kinds and degrees crying, "Do not reason. If a distinction is wanted, here is one." The public use of the reason always should be free, but the private use ought always to be rigidly restricted. By public use I mean the scientific literary use; by private, that which may be taken advantage of by civil officials and public functionaries. Since the governmental machinery must be kept in motion, in order to preserve unity and attain our object, we must not reason, we must obey. But the same individual who is bound, from this point of view, to passive obedience, has the right to speak in his capacity of citizen and scholar. He can make an appeal to the public, submit it to his observations on events which occur around him and in the ranks above him, taking care, however, to avoid offences which are punishable. Reason, then, as much as you like, only obey. Kant, Fragment on the Liberty of Thought and of the Press, Tissot's translation. These words of the great philosopher outline for me my duty. I have delayed the reprint of the work entitled What is Property? in order that I might lift the discussion to the philosophical height from which ridiculous clamour has dragged it down, and that, by a new presentation of the question, I might dissipate the fears of good citizens. I now re-enter upon the public use of my reason, and give truth full swing. The second edition of the first memoir on property will immediately follow the publication of this letter. Before issuing anything further, I shall await the observations of my critics and the co-operation of the friends of the people and of equality. Hitherto I have spoken in my own name and on my own personal responsibility. It was my duty. I was endeavouring to call attention to principles which antiquity could not discover, because it knew nothing of the science which reveals them, political economy. I have then testified as to facts. In short, I have been a witness. Now my role changes. It remains for me to deduce the practical consequences of the facts proclaimed. The position of public prosecutor is the only one which I am henceforth fitted to fill, and I shall sum up the case in the name of the people. I am, sir, with all the consideration that I owe to your talent and your character, your very humble and most obedient servant, P.J. Proudhon, pensioner of the Academy of Besançon. P.S. During the session of April 2nd, the Chamber of Deputies rejected by a very large majority the Literary Property Bill, because it did not understand it. Nevertheless, literary property is only a special form of the right of property, which everybody claims to understand. Let us hope that this legislative precedent will not be fruitless for the cause of equality. The consequence of the vote of the Chamber is the abolition of capitalistic property, property incomprehensible, contradictory, impossible, and absurd. End of conclusion, part 3. End of What is Property by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.